Welcome to Astrology Now, Crucial Insights for Critical Times. I decided to create this introduction entitled Cosmic Chemistry to provide you with some background, some context to what you can expect and understand from the insights gleaned from a generic perspective. Now, what I mean by generic is that we're looking at any given moment at where the planets are in real time. Now, this produces a type of gestalt, an internal holistic logic of synchronicity, probabilities that will occur in the world. And when we look at the world stage, we can see these occurring. However, where the chemistry comes in as a metaphorical term, okay, cosmic chemistry is a metaphorical term, which refers to the relationship of the planetary alignments in their whole perspective, looking at any particular subject. Let's just refer to the perspective of the planets in real time in their whole perspective, as with looking at an astrology chart as a whole. Always important to remember that. If you isolate any part in the whole, you miss some of the deeper essence. It's like taking somebody's eye and removing it from their body and looking at it, or, just looking at a close-up of their eye alone. You don't know anything about the person, so you lack a lot of information. So that is an indication, an example of looking at a part. Admittedly, each part does contain within it a fractal perspective of the whole. A fractal means, based on the philosophy of holism, we can understand each whole contains within it the whole of the entire universe if you probe deeply enough. But when we look at any given moment in time, we need to take more or less a snapshot of the heavens from our earthly geocentric perspective, and gain thereby a sense of the relationships between the planets, which are indeed ever in motion. So it's sort of an endeavor to grab a static perspective, just like a photograph, of any given situation, which offers a lot of information, but less than what a video would. But even a video itself, as animated and alive as it is, lacks the deeper story. And that's where we watch movies and we see a bigger story, and we get into the plot, the characters, the setting, and so on. And the more that's done well by the producers and directors and creators of those movies, the more engrossed we are in, and the more we appreciate the quality of the production, etc. Now, the same is somewhat true when might hear out there astrologers talking about what's going on, and it's all very valid and interesting and intriguing, etc. But how does it relate to me on one level, and how does it relate to any other aspect of reality? And that's where the chemistry comes in as, again, a metaphorical term. So what I'm saying here is you have to take this generic real-time perspective of the planets and apply it to a person or a place or an institution. So it would be applied thereby to your chart as a person cast for the moment you were born. But that is also true of a country, a province, a state, and any institution of an official sort within those geographical, national, legal boundaries. So it's like you can see where there's a co-creative game involved in it all. The astrology of the country would be wide angle, but would encompass the astrology of states and or provinces. But then you can zero in and see how the cosmic planetary alignments would apply to each state. You can apply that to each city. You can apply that into institutions within those places. So each of those institutions, countries, provinces, states people have an astrology chart. Okay, so I've mentioned this quite a lot in my writings over the years, and I always remind people that by purely looking at the generic perspective, there are insights that are relevant, but that if you don't go to the deeper understanding of a relationship principle that is underway, then you miss something very vital. And it's that missing piece which also can open up what is being said about the astrological weather, if you like. It's open to criticism as being vague. And there's a truth in that. There is a vagueness. What is being shared in terms of facts and details about the planets in their relationship according to the model of the astrological system being used, which is also an important understanding. I, generally in these particular Astrology Now videos, I'm looking at Western astrology. If I was looking at it through the lens of Vedic astrology or Mayan or Chinese or any other, I would then apply the principles like a language accordingly. So it's important to note which system you're using, and you want to get past the notion that the one system's the only system, that kind of religious dogma. It's kind of embarrassing to yourself, and it's an insult to cosmic consciousness as well. It's just a very biased, kind of dogmatic attitude to think that one system of astrology is the only one. Once again, a monotheism, if you like. All of them work, and it all depends on who is using them and the quality of their knowledge and experience and insights and wisdom, etc. are all features. So it's always good to note that. And if you have fallen prey to such kind of dogmatic thinking, I'd encourage you free yourself of that and understand that each system of astrology is like a language, and no one is absolute. Even if one is considered older than the other, it doesn't really apply, actually. It's like saying an old language is truer than a new language. It's sort of silly. There may be qualitative perspectives that you gain from that, but anyway, moving back to it, we're looking at Western tropical astrology, which is the system based on the seasonal round. It's more true to time as we experience it in terms of the seasonal round, which is linked, it's a relationship between Sun and Earth very specifically. But the main point remains that what the planetary alignments are doing, and even if you stripped all of the background of signs and so on, houses, and just worked with the planets alone, you would see a relationship between them. And that internal relationship they share has layers. There's a surface layer, then there's deeper layers, and those layers that you can go deeply into require increasingly more background understanding of the system, of the language, if you like. It's just like many people speak and even write at a relatively acceptable and reasonably intelligent level when it comes to, let's say, any language. They might write and speak that language, but that does not make them per se a writer or a linguist or a psychologist or a philosopher, if you like. There's levels and layers to anything of insight and depth of understanding, etc. So the same is true of looking at the generic perspective of planets. So what I do and I will do as you go along is notice that I'll talk about on the surface, then I'll suggest at deeper levels, this is suggesting this, etc. So you can go away purely, especially with the deeper layers of insight, with perspectives that will reveal what's really going on, and in a generic, global, synchronistic way. It's also important to note that each planet in its position in relationship to the other planets can be expressed in a full wide range. So the chart as a whole, but even if we emphasize one of the parts within the whole without dismissing the whole, we understand that the outer expression of that planet's position will differ in its cosmic chemistry relationship with the subject it's applying to. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what that means is there can be a rather harmonious, say, Venus in Pisces, but that Venus in Pisces generally may even be forming positive aspects to other planets in real time in that chart. But if you applied that aspect to something in your own chart, which itself, based on the cycles of your destiny, has layers, it's possible that it could trigger some sort of negative outer experience. For example, Venus in Pisces, which is sort of like an unconditional kind of true love principle at a spiritual level, could imply that you're in a relationship and true love arrived for the person you're in a relationship with. See, it could activate within your story, according to the deeper themes of your destiny, that somebody you care about or are in love with happens to be getting an activation according to their destiny of a love for somebody else. That would be quite negative, of course, but it's just a good example of how nothing is pat. Okay, that's the main takeaway. Thinking in a pat, conclusive way, oh, there it is, that's the answer, that's an elementary kind of approach. It it definitely is the mark of a beginner who hasn't observed. You can have knowledge of astrology and you can offer a lot of really wonderful insights, but until you learn to observe what's really going on, you're sort of knowledgeable but not experienced. And once you start to develop that observational experience, you become less assumptive. You become more aware of the importance of every case on its own ground. So what's tricky about this understanding is that it puts in check any final, conclusive, interpretive, outcome-oriented perspectives shared by anybody offering insights regarding what's going on right now. If they don't apply that to persons that come under the heading of entire countries, provinces, states, institutions of a legal sort, and individuals, it's generic. It's sort of like saying right now, we might say it's, for example, mid-May, and in the upper regions of the world, in the northern hemisphere, it's springtime, but in the southern, it's autumn, right? So we recognize that its equal and opposite is in another location. Now that's just one example, and bringing hemispheric influence into the equation isn't the best in the sense that it can be confusing for you, but just generally it's true to offer the or make the point that every case must be approached on its own ground. None of these factors reduce astrology to not working. Such reductionistic thinking is clever. Indeed, it can be very clever. It can be remarkable how much one can use logic and rhetoric to reduce something to non-existence. But as wonderful as one may do that, say, to anything, and with quantum physics you could do that, for example, you could reduce anything to nothing. but it doesn't mean it's a conclusion. It's just a clever angle of perspective that in a more ultimate sense, yes, maybe that thing or existence itself does not even really exist. Okay, so it can get very clever. But at worst, there's a lot of unscrupulous behavior in the world from the standpoint of agents, if you like, who are destined and or hired to confuse and confound. It's a bit of black magic, or at least gray as a term, which means manipulation. Black magic is coercive, gray is manipulative, and then there's many shades of gray. So in a more sincere approach, one begins to appreciate that for all intents and purposes in the journey of life, these things do exist, and they do have application and value and worth, and it all depends on who is applying them and how. So all of which is simply to say that at any given moment, the generic perspective of the planets should be understood as that. And if you go into the deeper layers, wow, you can get a lot of insight. But even so, it remains that you have to apply them to somebody's chart or a person in the eyes of the law, a country, a province, a state, a territory, an institution of any kind. It has to be applied to really know how that is in relationship with that entity. Okay, that entity, that person need not be a sentient being. It's actually an interesting reality. It's part of the game of life. We, by our laws and by our whole social structure, and with the principles, let's say, legally binding signatures, ceremonies, etc., we're co-creating principle of reality by establishing a country on a certain day of signatures, or the same is true of locations and organizations, etc. By that stroke of a pen, we have engaged that entity into a legal reality which the larger social sphere, both nationally and internationally, encompasses. So you can see where it gets rather interesting. Now, in between, just so we have the generic perspective of the planets at any given point, you can get a lot of insights by just looking at those, which can be really valuable. But then it's your job to take those insights and observe the synchronicities of them in real time, which you can do. You can indeed do that. So it's not to say you can't at all. You can. And you'll see trends and rhythms and synchronicities, etc., as above, so below, as within, so without. You'll see, yes, wow, I can see that, but others won't. Now, if you were to take it to the next level and apply those planetary positions to your actual chart, well, then you would really see how they're playing out in your life. And again, you can do that for locations of any size and measure. Now, one more thing I want to mention here is about horoscopes. Horoscopes sit in between the two. They sit in between the generic and the very personal. Because they're based on the sun signs, there's 12, and each sun sign creates a more specific emphasis of that whole perspective of the planets, we can gain a little bit more leverage. So, and then you, according to your sun sign, would recognize that you, even though there's people who say your sun sign's Aries, there's people all over the planet who are Aries, but in a way, because that's your sun sign, according to Western astrology, anyway, you're a part of the Aries club. Now, it's true that the planets progress, and you could, by your age, you could be progressed into Taurus or Gemini, etc., but it still remains that your natal chart, that magic moment when you took your first breath, is very, very important. And it anchors it's like a seal, a cosmic seal that you were born with, a code. And it will remain true throughout your life despite progressions and so forth, all the finer techniques of astrology that show the journey of your life over time, all of which are very relevant, very valid, very real, very techniques which will render very good results in terms of prediction and what's going on and when, etc. But the other whole side of the story is simply that the zodiac and the 12 signs, as with horoscopes, gives just a little bit more emphasis. So there's a little bit of a bridge between the generic and the very personal. So something to be aware of, and that's why horoscopes can be quite useful. And so, by the way, I do write a weekly horoscope, and it's available for free on my website, sunstarrastrology.com, as you can see there. And you can also get the paid version, which gives you $4.99 a month subscription, which gives you deeper insights each week with weekly and monthly videos. And you also get discounts on readings, so that's pretty good too. So there you go, some insights about how the generic perspective of the planets in real time do provide insights in layers, and I will be showing you that in the course of this series. You'll be able to learn as you go along just by listening and coming to a deeper understanding, even though I won't be in this particular series providing a foundational build-up of education. I will do that at another time, but for now you'll at least get some insights in work in progress, you might say. You'll be able to induce and deduct from what you're seeing and hearing, and then come away with an appreciated, refined understanding that there's the generic to the personal, that cosmic chemistry. In between, there's horoscopes, which bring it a little bit closer to that very personal. And all on its own, the generic perspective will offer rather interesting, remarkable insights to observe the synchronicities at play. So there you go, a bit of intro for you to Astrology Now, Crucial Insights for Critical Times. And as we go through different observational points to particular aspects, I'll give you examples. So I decided not to do it here. So on those here and there, I'll bring forward the example of a location to clarify the point even further. So thanks for your time, and see you in future videos.